In the shimmering heart of ancient Rome, where towering marble columns stood tall and golden palaces glittered in the sun, a hidden truth remained buried beneath the surface, one that historians have often chosen to overlook. While the world celebrates Rome's grand architecture, its battlefield victories, and its contributions to law and governance, the cost of such magnificence is seldom discussed. It was a cost not measured in gold or stone, but in the lives of countless young boys, many barely into their teens, who were forced into lives of submission. These boys were handpicked, not for intellect or strength, but for their faces, skin, and form. They were plucked from war-torn regions, from conquered Greek cities, Germanic forests, or distant eastern provinces, and paraded through slave markets where Roman elites examined them as one would livestock.
Oh.
To speak when spoken to laugh when told, to perform, always perform. Age, origin, and appearance were all that mattered. Roman law had structure. Some rights even extended to certain slaves. But for male concubines, there was a gray zone. They were neither acknowledged nor shielded. The master's word was final. Authorities turned blind eyes. Crying out for help meant risking brutal retaliation, or worse, being sold again to a harsher fate. Smiles became armor. Submission became survival. And the line between self and performance blurred. No personal space, no possessions, no identity. Their only value was how well they could serve. These weren't ordinary servants or household helpers. They were enslaved not for labor, but for beauty. The next silence, scorn, or punishment for some invisible failure. Masters feared connection. A bonded concubine might grow stronger, might hope, might resist. And resistance, even in thought, was a threat. It kept them uncertain, always trying to guess what would earn approval and what would bring pain. Greek boys were favored for their refined manners and education, while Germanic youths were sought after for their pale features and robust frames. The buyers rarely gave thought to the terror behind those young eyes, forced to become concubines, personal companions of Rome's most powerful and wealthy men. Their youth, charm, and innocence were commodities. These boys entered grand homes, but their lives were no longer their own. They lived under constant surveillance, expected to please, to smile, and to remain ever obedient. Their masters could call for them at any hour. Their bodies were no longer private, their emotions irrelevant. If they hesitated or showed resistance, punishment awaited. If they submitted, a hollow form of reward, maybe finer clothes or sweetened words, reinforced the illusion of care. But it was all conditional, and their stories, silenced by time, revealed the darker undercurrent of Rome's so-called glory. This system wasn't accidental. It was built to exploit. Imagine standing there, naked under judgmental eyes, while strangers debated your price, not as a person, but as an object of pleasure. Once sold, the reality began. Even the so-called privileges came with strings. Some were allowed to learn reading, music, or dance, but not for self-development. It was to become better entertainers. Meanwhile, others less fortunate were tossed into cramped quarters, called upon only for the satisfaction of their master's whims. What made this existence even more cruel was the total absence of legal protection. Psychological manipulation was woven into every part of their day. One moment they might receive praise or kindness. Many were kept deliberately isolated, separated from other slaves or household staff to prevent friendships or emotional support. Inside their minds, these boys lived in endless confusion, punished one day, favored the next. While their outer world gleamed with gold, their inner world was built on fear and silence. In the 1st century AD, the lives of these boys were not just controlled, they were systematically stripped of anything that once made them who they were. Separated from their homelands, cut off from family and culture, they were made to forget their origins. There was no language from home, no rituals from their people, no familiar faces to offer even a moment of comfort. All of it erased deliberately to make them easier to mold. But their isolation didn't end there. Silken robes, delicate jewelry, all selected by the masters to show them off like dolls, like ornaments. When masters journeyed to villas in other provinces, the concubines followed, not as guests, but as possessions. Other slaves sometimes saw them as shameful, considering their position humiliating. Back home, their families waited, many never knowing what had become of their sons. Some mothers spent years in prayer. Some fathers held on to fading hope. In cultures where family was sacred, this silence was a second kind of death. Free citizens looked at them as nothing more than toys of the elite. Prices soared. And so, the cycle continued. Boys captured, sold, reshaped, displayed. This was not luxury. This was commerce in flesh. Debt slavery, the practice of offering a child to pay off a financial burden, placed parents in an impossible position. Some tried to escape. Their attempts were rarely successful. The Roman system was vast, and the consequences were brutal. If caught, they were punished not just physically but publicly, humiliated as a warning to others. Some tried to end their own suffering through suicide, but even that was often denied to them. Their masters, having invested heavily in them, made sure they were watched, guarded, and stripped of anything that could be used for self-harm. Their lives were not their own, not even their deaths. Save the many by sacrificing one. The pain of that decision haunted both the ones who stayed and the ones who were taken. In this hierarchy, they stood alone. Not respected, not accepted, only used. They were expected to adjust quickly to new people, new rooms, new customs, all while continuing to serve and remain silent. The gods worshipped in Rome seemed to offer protection to citizens and warriors, but not to concubines. Some boys turned secretly to foreign faiths, underground cults, or whispered prayers from their homelands. But even this had to be hidden, as their beliefs, like their bodies, were under constant surveillance. Every new place only reminded them that there was nowhere they belonged. They glittered in gold, but it was a prison of silk. Their luxury was a costume stitched together with suffering. The more beautiful they looked, the more forgotten they became. In some Roman households, masters owned multiple concubines at once. Some concubines were taught to read and write, to discuss literature or philosophy, but only as entertainment. They were trained to please intellectually, like court jesters of the mind. Every word they learned, every idea they expressed, was not theirs. It belonged to their master. They were taught how to sound intelligent, how to flatter, how to be graceful, not for their own growth, but for the pleasure of those who owned them. Instead of offering each other support, these boys were pushed into competition. Their masters would favor one today, another tomorrow. There were diets to preserve a youthful look, exercise regimens to keep their figures lean and soft, and grooming rituals to match the standards of their masters. In some cases, these young boys were forced into cosmetic alterations, painful procedures carried out with crude tools and no real medical knowledge. There was no concern for the boys' comfort, only for their visual appeal. A smile could earn attention, a wrong look could mean punishment, no trust could form between them because trust was a threat to the master's control. In this environment, betrayal wasn't a choice, it was survival. Even what appeared to be kindness, such as education, was just another form of control. And to maintain their appearance, strict routines were enforced. Their clothing, too, was chosen for them. Even travel, which from the outside might appear like a privilege, was just another chain. And within the complex social structures of Roman households, their roles became even more painful. The impact of this cruelty rippled far beyond the palace walls. In some cases, poverty drove families to give up their children willingly. And yet not all boys accepted their fate passively. Religion, which should have offered solace, did not. The demand for concubines turned into a market. Wealthy Romans began to compete. Who could have the most beautiful boy? Who could entertain the best? Traders took note. The commodification of human lives was nowhere more visible than in the bustling slave markets of Rome, where young boys were priced not for what they knew, but how they looked. These markets were filled with shouts, coins, and critical stares, but beneath the surface, something far more disturbing was happening. Boys, some as young as 10, stood silently, examined like merchandise. Each body, each smile, each glance was assigned a value. Humanity disappeared behind a number. They were trained to serve, obey, flatter, and perform, all while learning to bury who they really were. Instructors didn't just teach posture and language. They taught how to mask fear with a smile. To maintain this cycle, entire institutions were created. Dark training schools where children were stripped of their past and reshaped into living decorations. They were never allowed to develop their own identities, to explore innocence, or to build friendships based on choice. These facilities mimicked the structure of gladiator schools, except, instead of preparing warriors for battle, they molded boys for servitude and charm. Their development was not stunted by poverty, but by control. Others were simply cast out with no skills, no money, and nowhere to go. And their stories, while sometimes celebrated, were heartbreaking reminders of how uncommon true escape really was. A few rare individuals managed to build new lives, reinvent themselves, and escape their past. Illness was only treated if it threatened a concubine's performance. Every moment of growth was redirected towards someone else's vision of perfection. Mental anguish, of course, wasn't even acknowledged. These boys weren't expected to feel. They were expected to serve. Many of the boys entered these institutions before their voices had even deepened. The line between survival and surrender blurred, until even they couldn't remember what was real. Instead, they were shaped like clay, carved and painted to please others. Treatment varied across the vast empire. In some Roman provinces, local customs introduced slightly softer conditions. In others, concubines endured even harsher routines, and how to show gratitude even when they felt nothing but fear. Festivals meant long hours in ornate outfits, entertaining guests and performing like trained pets. These were the same people who praised honor, virtue, and discipline. And in a society that treated them like shadows, that was an act of extraordinary courage. But no matter the region, the truth remained. Their freedom was non-existent. Their consent was irrelevant. Their fate was sealed by the market. And when the glow of youth began to fade, when their skin lost its softness, or their faces no longer held the same allure, they were discarded. Unlike field slaves or craftsmen who could prove useful over time, these boys had been selected for one thing only: beauty. And once that was gone, so was their value. Rest wasn't freedom. It was a pause between demands. Some were sold again, not to better homes, but to harsher ones. But they carried invisible scars, the kind that don't fade with time. A nod, a glance, a coded word passed in the hallway. In these brief exchanges, they found something real, a spark of shared pain, a fragile network of hope. Even when it came to health, care was offered not out of compassion, but to preserve the investment. Pain was tolerated as long as the master was pleased. Among the elite of Rome, this system wasn't questioned, it was embraced. But their morality stopped where their comfort began. To them, these boys were no different than furniture, something to display, enjoy, and replace. To survive, many boys became masters of subtlety. They learned how to predict moods, when to speak, when to be silent. Their faces became masks, their smiles, tools, their silence, a defense mechanism. Roman life followed seasonal rhythms, and so did their suffering. In quieter seasons, they hoped for rest, but found only the anxiety of anticipation. Despite being kept apart, the boys developed their own secret languages. They warned each other of dangers. They comforted when they could. It wasn't rebellion, but it was resistance. Quiet, invisible, and deeply human. And that may be the most powerful truth of all, even in a world designed to strip them of everything. Their names, their dignity, their futures. These boys still reached out to one another. In silence, they told each other, "I see you, you matter." When Rome's grandeur echoed through marble streets and power rested in the hands of a privileged few, the lives of countless young boys remained confined in silence and shadow, though invisible to most. Their pain ran deep, hidden beneath. The glittering facades of palatial villas and buried in the quiet corners of society that refused to speak their names, a whispered warning, a brief glance of understanding, or a shared moment of stillness. These interactions offered emotional lifelines in an otherwise isolating existence. The normalization of using human beings for pleasure turned exploitation into habit, and habit into culture. It became easier to accept cruelty, not only toward concubines, but toward slaves, gladiators, and prisoners of war. But read between the lines, and the pain is there. These young boys were never given time to grieve, to rest, or to prepare. Others formed long-term attachments, claiming affection, but still keeping the boys bound by chains of control. These constant movements denied them the chance to root themselves anywhere. Boys were trained in poetry, music, and conversation not to express themselves, but to entertain their owners. They might recite Virgil flawlessly or pluck melodies on a lyre, yet they were forbidden to write their own thoughts or sing their own truths. They were walking archives of beauty, never the creators of it. Other slaves might envy their luxuries or resent their closeness to the master. Free members treated them as decoration, not people. In truth, the concubine's position was built entirely on a lie: luxury without power, visibility without identity. Any bond they formed was precarious, always one wrong word away from collapse. They lived in shifting environments, changing languages, new sets of servants and guards. Boys were kidnapped from villages, sold by desperate families, or claimed through war. From Gaul to Judea, from Egypt to Hispania, human cargo flowed toward the capital. Silk tunics, golden bracelets, and perfumed oils served to advertise the owner's wealth and taste. A boy with musical ability fetched more than one who didn't. A boy with blonde hair. A rare novelty in some provinces might be worth double. In this system, worth was measured not in character, but in surface. But for the boy, these were symbols of lost autonomy. These boys, even when stripped of everything, managed to carve out pieces of themselves and offer them to others. A secret song, a carved token, a name whispered only to a trusted friend. Even his own body was not his to control. It had been decorated and redesigned by someone else's desire. The loneliness was engineered, a tool as sharp as any blade. Traders profited. Generals paid debts. Families wept. Entire regions bore the scars of this pipeline, not just the boys themselves. With every new city came fresh dangers, fresh isolation. Masters and their agents studied behavior, isolated vulnerabilities, and used reward and punishment cycles to rewire personalities. Today it would be called systematic abuse. Then it was called preparation. Some concubines were left permanently disfigured by experiments meant to make them more perfect. The word care was a facade. Their health mattered only so long as it supported their function. The mental toll of endless relocation was profound, the loss of place becoming the loss of self. Concepts like consent, love, trust, they were foreign. Even when freedom was eventually gained, if ever, the damage lingered. These men carried broken concepts of self, fear of touch, shame of existence. Healing was a mountain few could climb. Both situations denied true security. Whether adored or discarded, the boy's fate always remained at the mercy of someone else's mood. Instead, they were uprooted like furniture, shipped across provinces. Entering new homes where rules changed, expectations shifted, and cruelty took unfamiliar forms. Each new master meant relearning survival from scratch. A gesture that earned kindness before might now trigger punishment. Loneliness, powerlessness, and a constant performance of gratitude defined the lives being alluded to. Dehumanization spread like a silent poison, infecting every level of Roman life. Concubines were made to perform dances, recitations, and private rituals. They were displayed like trophies, smiling, charming, flawless, while inside they crumbled. The outside world saw celebration. The boys lived humiliation. The comfort was fleeting, but real. It reminded them, if only briefly, that they weren't alone. Among the ruins of wealthy Roman homes, scholars have found tools of control, shackles disguised as jewelry, mirrors placed for constant surveillance, and grooming instruments designed more for appearance than comfort. The goal was a polished appearance, not health. Comfort and consent were irrelevant. The boys endured painful procedures with no medical knowledge, no pain relief, and no choice. Scattered among these were personal items, worn sandals, carved wooden trinkets, or bits of cloth embroidered by trembling hands. Each artifact whispers a story, even if the names have been lost. During particularly difficult times, these boys, concubines, and the households of Rome's elite relied on fragile, secret connections to survive. This system, brutal in its intimacy, didn't just shape the lives of its victims, It shaped Roman society as a whole. Archaeological discoveries provide fragmented glimpses into the lives of these forgotten victims. Literature of the time rarely addressed the reality directly. Writers chose euphemisms and soft metaphors, brushing past the truth with poetic distance. The transitions from one master to another were particularly traumatic. Some masters treated their concubines as fleeting amusements, replacing them like seasonal decorations. As Rome's elite migrated between urban estates and countryside villas, their concubines followed. Education in theory should have empowered them. Instead, it was a cruel irony. Physical regimens ensured they remained pleasing to the eye. Daily routines included strict diets, forced exercise, and body modifications that ranged from oil treatments to brutal cosmetic practices. During seasonal festivals, the pressure intensified. Grand celebrations meant grander demands. Relationships within households were complex. Behind the scenes, a vast trade network fed the Roman appetite. Training involved more than skills. It was deep psychological manipulation. Clothing wasn't just vanity, it was branding. Grooming and medical practices were often extreme. From forced skin lightening to painful hair removal, these procedures left lasting damage. Growing up in this system meant never learning basic human boundaries. Social isolation only deepened the wounds. Many masters deliberately separated their concubines from other slaves, fearing the formation of friendships, alliances, or escape plans. Even the economy viewed them as numbers. Market prices fluctuated based on skin tone, age, body shape, or cultural background. And yet, in all this darkness, there were moments of light. Silent alliances, small gestures of resistance, shared memories. In the end, what this system tried hardest to erase their humanity was the very thing they fought hardest to preserve. The value of a concubine often hinged on their appearance and background. This process of turning people into products made it easier for masters to treat these young men not as human beings, but as disposable possessions. A society that could tolerate and even celebrate the routine mistreatment of vulnerable children was also capable of far broader injustice. It was no coincidence that the same culture enjoyed gladiator games and responded to rebellion with brutal suppression, stripped away dignity, and allowed cruelty to be justified through custom and commerce. The normalization of such abuse didn't just affect the boys who were trapped in this system. It infected Roman culture itself. Others kept them close for years, still controlling every aspect of their lives. Neither fate offered true safety. Everything rested on the master's unpredictable favor. They described affection or loyalty without addressing the brutal imbalance of power behind those words. They were taught music, poetry, and polished conversation, all designed to please others. Their talents weren't theirs to use. They were tools, sharpened for someone else's entertainment. With each change came fear, unfamiliar rules, new expectations, uncertain dangers. Their comfort didn't matter, only their appearance. Grooming and medical procedures were forced on them with no concern for consent or long-term harm. Survival meant adapting, relearning every behavior that might earn mercy or avoid punishment. While the world saw celebration, the concubines saw pressure, performance, and exposure. The concubines followed, dragged into new environments, forced to adjust to different customs and people. Everyone knew that their place depended solely on the master's mood. Real friendships were rare, and love was dangerous. The result was constant instability. It belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. Keeping them apart from others ensured they remained dependent and powerless. Stopping it would have required Rome to change its values, something that never happened. Boys were captured, sold by families, or taken in war. And while it worked in many ways, it also revealed something powerful: the human will to survive. It was a form of psychological conditioning that would be recognized today as long-term emotional abuse. Some whispered secrets, others shared food or gave comfort. A few even tried to escape. Most were punished, some severely. But their actions proved something important. The human spirit cannot be fully broken. Quiet months gave no peace, only a countdown to the next wave of demands. These boys lived in fear of what came next, never allowed to rest fully. Through the smallest acts, a shared glance, a quiet refusal, a final prayer. They remained human. And their courage tells us that even in silence, the soul speaks. Their stories are more than footnotes. They're warnings, lessons, reminders of what happens when power goes unchallenged. This trait affected not only the victims, but the villages, families, and communities they came from. The harm rippled outward. To end it would have meant seeing concubines as people, and Rome chose not to. They were patched up when necessary, not to heal, but to continue serving. Pain was acceptable if they still looked pleasing. These boys didn't learn about boundaries, consent, or affection in healthy ways. Even if they later gained freedom, the emotional wounds remained. Many never truly recovered. The loss of sons devastated parents, friends, and neighbors. The trade didn't just hurt the concubines, it tore through entire communities. But if you read carefully, between the lines of these old texts, the truth begins to appear, one of exploitation disguised as tradition. Evidence of this suffering has faded over time, but archaeological traces remain. Artifacts found in Roman villas hint at lives once lived in fear and silence. Their appearance was never their own. It was arranged, crafted, and displayed. Some items suggest control or restraint. Others whisper of the daily routines and forgotten rituals of these boys. Most of what they endured, however, was never recorded. Their pain was silenced both in life and in history. Roman authors often spoke of these relationships in vague or softened terms. When a concubine was transferred to a new master, it was like beginning life all over again. Some owners quickly lost interest and passed their concubines off into regular servitude, or sold them again. Wealthy Romans often moved between homes throughout the year, from city estates to country villas. Education was part of their training, but never for personal growth. They were expected to remain beautiful. That meant following strict diets, exercise regimens, and often painful body modifications. Public celebrations and festivals only added to their suffering. These were times of extra attention and extra demand. Then households, their relationships with others were always fragile. The system that fed Rome's appetite for concubines stretched across the empire. The methods used to train these boys were refined over generations, carefully designed to break resistance and create obedience. Clothes and jewelry were part of the control. They were dressed not for comfort, but to show off their master's wealth and taste. Even basic medical care was about control. The effect of growing up in this environment was devastating. Social isolation was a deliberate tactic. Masters wanted control over every aspect of their lives, and that included relationships. The economic system surrounding concubines encouraged cruelty. As long as money could be made from buying and selling boys, the system thrived. All of this, the training, the control, the exploitation, was designed to make concubines compliant. Even in the most oppressive circumstances, these young men found ways to resist. Roman religion and philosophy offered no real refuge. The same thinkers who spoke of justice and ethics ignored the boys in their own homes. Their ideals ended where their privilege began. Even the yearly rhythms of Roman life created cycles of suffering. Back in the villages where they were taken, families grieved. Roman law did not recognize them as people. Legally, they were objects, invisible in the eyes of the courts. Their abuse was not only tolerated, but expected. This system fed itself. Profit kept it alive. Yet in the face of all this, these boys held on. Their suffering tells us that progress built on pain is no true progress.